everybody. Lovely to see you all. Welcome to our session this morning. I am Amy Shaw, co-manager of BECTU Vision. It's lovely to see so many familiar faces on the morning. We put on this, I am co-manager of BECTU Vision, and BECTU Vision provides freelance training for people working in Scotland. This course today is funded by Screen Scotland, BBC and Scottish Union Learning. We're delighted to be able to put this session on. It was a request from one of the productions that's filming in Scotland at the moment. We're really happy to kind of support any training needs that everybody has, and we try to be as responsive as possible. So if you do have any ideas for training, we're very much keen to help put in any courses that you have, any suggestions. And as I say, this was one from a production that's happening at the moment in Scotland, and we're delighted that we were able to put it on for you and open it up to the wider freelance community here as well. The session is due to run until 12 o'clock today. I'll pass over to Steve shortly, but if there's any problems with the Zoom link, if you disconnect, please just reconnect using the same one. I am going to be on for the whole call today, so if you have any tech issues or any questions at all, please don't hesitate to drop me a little message, and I will pass over to Steve.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Lovely to meet you all. Welcome to our little course on SAG and trying to understand, in particular, the thing we're going to be looking at is the paperwork side of things. I'm a production manager at UPM, and I'll be looking at this more from the production point of view. So we'll be looking at, what goes into bringing SAG-Cast on board. We'll be looking at things like contracts, the types of agreements that they sit under, how the working day needs to be applied, and various other elements that you'll probably start seeing on a daily basis when you deal with SAG. Just as a general question to the room, has anyone dealt with any SAG performers before? Are we coming to this completely new? Have we had sort of a little bit of involvement? I can see a couple of nodding heads. So I'm going to try and approach this in kind of like a cleaner form as possible. So in some cases, some of you might be like, "Ooh, kind of teaching me to suck eggs here." Like, I know this, but for others, it might be completely brand new. So I want to try and make sure that we're balancing this as much as we can. So let me try and share my screen. Hold on. Pleased to know there is a very beautiful slide deck coming towards you. How do I share? Okay. So we'll make a copy of this available to you guys at the end of the Zoom as well, just so you're aware. Okay, right. Does that come up? Can everyone see that? Great. Okay, so SAG. So understanding SAG paperwork, that's kind of our main function. So we're going to be the things we're going to look at this morning. We're going to look at the SAG agreement and the different types. We're going to be looking at something called a cast info sheet, which then leads into the day out of days, which I'm sure you will all be familiar with already. We'll then be covering something called a Station 12, which is quite an important piece of paperwork that the production office needs to fill out. We'll then be looking at, in particular, the different types of contracts that you'll see. And something that you are going to see on a daily basis in the production office, the Exhibit G. And that then leads into the final cast list and the casting data report, which you'll do at the end of the show. So, are we ready? I will precurse this with, there's going to be a lot of very dull things we're going to be talking about. I'm going to try and keep the energy as much as possible, because I know for many people, this can get a little bit tedious. So as fun as we can make it, the better. So one thing that I always tell people they must check, every studio operates very slightly differently. So the very first thing you should do when you come on board to a production, please go over your studio's production guide or have a chat with the production executive to get a grasp of how they deal with SAG. Because what you'll find, particularly with some of the bigger studios, they have a separate union department that gets very involved and deals with a lot of this stuff for you. With some other studios, you may find they step away and there's a much more emphasis on the production office to deal with it. So understanding where that balance is so we don't tread on toes is very important. So who is covered by SAG? That's the important thing we want to know. So obviously US actors, any US actors coming over are more than likely going to be on SAG. A lot of international actors. So you'll probably find there's a lot of UK actors that appear as SAG, and that's because they're probably doing a lot of the majority of their work abroad, or they're of a certain stature that they have managed to get signed on with SAG. And you'll also see stunts, assuming that they're not UK stunts under an equity contract. You'll probably find if you're bringing any stunts over from the States, they will all be under a stunt contract with SAG. So what type of agreements have we got? So the way SAG splits out, there's a theatrical agreement, there's a television agreement, and there's a new media agreement. So the theatrical agreement that is primarily based for anything that has a guaranteed theatrical distribution, anything that is a budget over 2 million. And that basically sets the minimum standard that all SAG casts will be operating under. They do also have a SAG low budget agreement for under 2 million. However, the caveat to that is you can't shoot with it internationally. So for us, it's not applicable. Then when you move into the world of television, they then also have a separate agreement for that. Now, unlike the theatrical agreement, which is looking at, in particular, the budget level, in the world of TV, it's determined more by, the episodes, the length, as well as the budget. Very similar to how we structure like the BECTU agreement, for instance. And then finally, the new media agreement. I always like to cover this because people get excited and assume that that's what Netflix is under. It's not necessarily. New media is where they're trying to cover things like YouTube. So what you'll find is anything that goes up to 1 million in terms of its budget spend, you're going to end up going straight back to the theatrical agreement. So it's sort of a null and void, from our point of view in particular, it's kind of a null and void contract to look at. But I always like to represent that so that we don't all get confused. So something you're going to hear quite a lot, particularly if you're working in the UK, particularly if you're doing maybe a mid-range budget show, is something called Global Rule 1. So Global Rule 1, this is the specific blurb that you'll see from SAG. Basically, Global Rule 1, I'll kind of cover, I won't read that out as it is. You can read that in your own time. But the general approach of Global Rule 1 is that no member of SAG will provide any services that are not meeting the minimum standards. So that means the minimum rate, that means the fringes. Fringes are very important because that's quite a big percentage on top. And all the standard in terms of working will never breach the collective bargaining agreement that's been agreed. Now, that's all fine and dandy. But in some cases, particularly if you're doing a low budget show, those SAG fringes in particular, which are over 30%, are going to create a massive difference in your budget and going to cause a lot of difficulties in terms of getting things over the line, particularly if you're doing a very, very low budget show. So what you do find is you'll hear a waiver being spoken about quite a lot. Now, this is, to be completely clear, a SAG waiver is not a guaranteed thing, okay? It's something that is an option that SAG can agree to, as long as you have put together a strong case. So it's issued case by case by SAG. It's often only really considered if you're doing a low budget show. If you're doing studio-based production, instantly, I very much doubt you'd get a waiver. It's looking at the balance of unions. So if the majority of your cast are all equity and you've got one player that will be SAG, they'll take that into consideration. If you've got your top 5 cast are all SAG, I don't think you'll get that over the line. It's looking at how the services of that SAG member are being employed. But in all cases, I would suggest that you have a chat with PACT, the Producers Guild, and the production executives of the production company that we're working with before going down a road like this. Most cases, what you will still end up with is paying fringes on top of whatever rate is agreed for that actor. I like to always try and present this because it's something that you hear battered around quite a lot on a UK-based production. but it's important just to know how that affects things, and particularly where it's actually applicable. Because largely, you know, if we're doing a show, like I said, where your top 5 or top 10 cast are all SAG, this is not applicable, and it is all case by case. It's not moving on. How do I move to the next one? You have frozen. Bear with. I'm just going to stop the share and then come back in again. Sorry.
So guys, we are just running through these slides today, but then there will be time for questions as well. So if you have got any questions, we've got plenty of time at the end to ask any of the ones that you've got. And we've also got the chat box at the bottom as well, because I realise some of you are at work and off screen at the moment. So if there's any questions that you have at any point, you can pop them in the chat box as well, and I'll keep an eye on that too.
As I said, all conversations, make sure you bring CACT into the conversation and your production executive. And of course, you can always have a conversation direct with the contracts department at SAG. I would suggest talking to CACT first and production execs. So when we talk about contracts, you also hear something called schedules mentioned quite a lot. And you'll see there, I'm not talking about the dudes or your one-liner. When I'm talking about schedules, I'm talking about a very specific element of a SAG contract. So schedules refer to the minimum performer contracts, wages and working conditions. It's part of the agreement that's been agreed. Each actor has a specific schedule that breaks down other elements within their deal. So there's a separate schedule for each performer, not each performer, but as in each performing type. For instance, if you're a daily, if you're weekly, if you're Schedule F, for instance, which we'll talk about in a minute, which is a buyout. And why would this matter? Well, it changes various elements like your overtime. It changes things like 6th and 7th days and holiday pay. And that all is very much dependent on which schedule these individuals are contracted under. So the most commonly used schedules are Schedule A, which covers a day performer, Schedule B, which covers a weekly performer, and Schedule F, which is anyone over 65K. I should make the slight caveat that this slide has actually gone out of date. That is now 80K since the new agreement. So it's actually 80K or more for Schedule F. The most common international schedules that you'll find are Schedule B, Schedule C, and Schedule F. Schedule B being a weekly, Schedule C is another type of a weekly, and Schedule F is our buyout. So that's really what our primary actors are going under. So our cast number 1, for instance, is more than likely going to be a Schedule F. And Schedule B obviously is more preferred when you're dealing with SAG. The reason, because obviously if you're putting them on a weekly contract, you have to bear in mind that travel days are included within that contract. So the time you have travelled someone in, they've had a fitting, they've shot for 1 day, they've travelled back, they've had a whole day in between, you're basically on a weekly contract. So you're unlikely to be using a daily for a SAG, unless they're based in the UK. Also, Schedule D, sorry, you'll see other like Schedules G, which covers things like professional singers, Schedule H, which covers stunt performers, Schedule K, which is stunt coordinators. The list of schedules is fairly extensive. I won't go into every single one because largely what you have to remember is SAG is designed from a domestic point of view. When I say domestic, I mean within the United States. So it's covering a lot of elements that would not necessarily be covered from our point of view in the UK. And as a general rule of thumb, the less you pay over the scale, the more that performer is going to earn on items like overtime and 6th and 7th days. And you'll see, as you look through the different schedules, you'll see these patterns appearing between the different ones. And then the more that you pay over the scale means more caps begin to apply. So this is a very quick overview. I would suggest, if you've got a spare, couple of hours, you fancy reading the equivalent of War and Peace, and you want to download the SAG agreement, have a little peruse through, and you'll see if you search schedule, the best way is to get the PDF and just search schedules, and you'll see all the different schedules appear. You can go through all the different elements, but what you can see here is the different ways it's applied, and you can see the different patterns between. So like we were discussing, you've got A, which is really your day performers. Similar to if you're doing an equity contract, we split things out in a daily and a weekly. That follows a very similar pattern with SAG. So you'll see separate agreements for daily players, weekly, depending on what they're earning. As I said, B and C are very similar. And then we get into the world of Schedule F, which is very much the buyout. This is what your primary talent is going under. You're going to buy out their time and their services throughout the period of your production. And you can see certain other elements like multi-track Schedule Fs, where the studio might be agreeing a certain amount of projects with them. That all kind of comes into play. And as I said, there's other schedules beyond those ones that we've just spoken about. So if you're going to bring in stunt performers from the US, they will appear under SAG. So you need to make sure that you're aware of Schedule H, which is basically covering all the key elements of a SAG stunt performer. In most cases, what you'll see is almost a direct correlation between the weekly Schedule B agreement, because it's very similar. There's a few little changes for a SAG cast. Obviously, it entitles them to things like stunt adjustments and things like that. Dancers, if there's dancers coming in from the States, you'll see that these are people that are professionally trained and they are a member of SAG. They will go under a Schedule J, sorry. And the thing I was most surprised by, airplane pilots. In the States, obviously, if they've got a lot of air work, they'll cover them under a SAG contract, which covers, their overtime, their weekly rate. And then stunt coordinators. So again, if you're bringing stunt performers over, Schedule H and Schedule K are the ones that you're going to be looking at the most. The thing to note is the rest periods with Schedule K are dramatically drop because they're a coordinator and they're not performing. That's kind of the key change between it. Again, it's kind of following a lot of the key elements of a Schedule B contract. So contract elements that we need to remember. SAG are on an 8-hour day. That's the thing to remember. In terms of when you look at the rate card, so available online, very easy to find. If you look up the SAG rate card, you can see the minimums for a theatrical production. Again, this is the base level. In all those instances, when you're looking at that rate is an 8-hour day. So you need to be mindful of that in terms of how you're calculating. If you're doing the budget, for instance, how you're calculating those days, if you're putting them on a weekly minimum SAG contract. Now, in most cases, when we're doing particular Schedule F, we'll be buying out. We'll probably be buying it out at 10 hours. But that is very much a negotiation on your business affairs point of view. It's more than likely always going to be 10 hours. But in terms of how their rates are calculated, it's calculated from 8 hours as the base. You'll see, obviously, the weekly rate, again, is an 8-hour day. As you go up the schedules and you enter into things like Schedule C, it becomes 10 hours. Schedule F is all kind of automatically, you'll be buying it out as 10 hours, as I already said. Forced calls. So this is the turnaround. This is actually the bit that, as a production office, as a production manager, for instance, we need to be making sure that we're aware of. From the AD point of view, hopefully the ADs are always very on this, and it's a conversation that you're always having to make sure both sides, with production and with ADs, are aware of what this entails. So the rule of thumb with SAG is that a full 12 hours of rest must be given between each day of shooting. I'm just going to, sorry, everyone's faces are currently in the way of the edge of my screen, so I can't actually see what I've written. There we go. I'll put you on the other side. Yeah, so 12 hours must be given between the shooting day. Now, the very important thing to remember when you're dealing with SAG, we are classed as a distant location. Now, there's two definitions in a SAG contract: a studio location and a distant location. We're always a distant location. Whether you're at a studio within the UK or not, you're always a distant location because you are outside of the US, which means, very importantly, portal to portal now applies. Portal to portal basically means that the clock starts when the performer is picked up from their home address or their hotel, more likely, and ends when they get dropped off at the door again. So that means your day is suddenly getting tighter and tighter. And it's very important to be aware of that and understanding how that's going to affect and making sure you're scheduling correctly. Because portal to portal can come in, particularly if you're shooting in fairly far-flung locations, it can become a real nightmare. So you need to be building in that travel time within their day. And the thing to remember, it gets very expensive when you start breaking their turnaround. So you'll find it's obviously very much dependent on what's been agreed in the deal, particularly if they're Schedule F. But as a general minimum rule of thumb, if you start breaking those turnarounds, they're paid an additional day's pay on top. So it suddenly starts to rack up very quickly. In addition, you need to make sure that you are giving a full rest period between shooting weeks of 56 hours. Happened again. I don't know why it's not liking the, maybe it's Keynote. All right, 2 seconds.
I hope that's clear for everyone. Everyone's following along at the moment, but as we say, if you've got any questions, just drop them in the chat, or you can raise your hand on screen, or you can use your little hand emoji from the reactions as well to ask any questions. And we're back on.
There we go. I'm going to blame Keynote. I'm not entirely sure why it keeps crashing. Right. The other thing to remember is travel days. So again, because we're a non-domestic production when we're shooting in the UK, travel days are applicable, and that needs to be applied at the start and end of when a performer is working with us. So every time that you are shooting outside, you're deemed an overnight location. And travel time is paid. So it's a paid day. And also any things that need to be reimbursed in terms of transport. But largely, I would assume if you're bringing SAG-cast on, you're probably covering those transport costs anyway. The other thing to remember is a whole day. So a whole day is a day that's paid in between. The basic rule of thumb is if a performer is not able to return home for any reason, you are paying for that time in between. So assuming that your SAG-cast are coming in from LA or New York, wherever they're coming from, they're not going to be returning home realistically. So you are going to be paying those whole days in between their shoot days. And that will need to be reflected. Same with the travel days will need to be reflected on the Exhibit G, which we'll come to very shortly. So this is now we're getting very more specific into the production office and bits that we need to be aware of as a production office, particularly I don't know if there's any production coordinators on here. Production managers, we need to make sure we're aware of this, but production coordinators, I shout out to you right now. What's on the screen, write down. So it's very important when we're bringing SAG-cast on that we're aware of these certain elements. So production company details. So when our production is signed up with SAG, you'll be given a SAG number, and that's specific to your production. That's important. Please make sure that you write that down. You'll either talk to the producer or The studio will tell you what it is. That needs to be in a document somewhere because you're going to use that a lot, pretty much every day. So make sure you've written that down somewhere. You'll probably memorize it by the end of the show, but write it down. The other thing, you need to make sure you're aware of what the US production entity is. So in most cases, you'll be running out of a US corporation that will be set up. That's generally the rule of thumb that we'll set up. That'll be an LLC company. If you're doing a really, really low budget show, they might operate slightly differently and use a private company to run things. But more than not, if you're doing a studio-based or, a good production level show, there'll be your UK entity, which will be covering all your UK crew, which will be a separate setup company for that. And then there'll be the US equivalent of that. SAG will all be going through the US equivalent. The other thing, as we start to go through the casting process, we need to make sure that we've got the actor's full name, and that's the name that they are assigned to SAG with. We need to make sure that we're aware of their loan out company if they're running out of a loan out. We need their home address, not because we're going to knock on the door, but we're going to need it as part of their SAG sign up. We're going to need their start dates and total contracted period, which will work out from the day out of days. You're also going to need their SSN, which is their social security number, or their SAG number. I would suggest asking for both, personally, just so you've got them. So when the production is being signed up with SAG, SAG will ask for an early draft of the day out of days. Now, you're all going to know what a day out of days is, so I'm not going to go into the details of that. Obviously, that is the breakdown of when cast are in. SAG will require to see this so that they can see the total period that performer or those performers will be applied. What I would tend to do is just denote on a copy of the day out of days who are going to be SAG when you send it to SAG. And this draft will need to be submitted with the application. So an early version will be needed as soon as possible. And then once you've got your SAG number, you set up with SAG, the production is rolling, you're going to hear, well, you might not hear it actually. I learned the hard way and realized almost too late, but luckily soon enough that I could resolve it when I was a young coordinator. You're going to hear something called a station 12. Now, a station 12 is actually very important, and this is where a lot of that information that I was talking about a few moments ago comes into play. A station 12 is required for every SAG performer. No SAG performer may start work on a production unless a station 12 has been submitted and SAG have approved it. And basically, this is SAG's way of ensuring that every performer that you bring onto your production has essentially paid their dues. They're not owing anything to SAG. They're good to perform. There's no issues. Now, I'm sure the likelihood of, Tom Cruise not having paid his dues is probably very, very low. But nevertheless, even if you're bringing Tom Cruise onto your production, you still need to do a station 12. And you'll need all of those details to go forward to SAG. If you don't do that, SAG can shut your production down. So it's very important that you do get that done and you do make sure it's done. If you have that needs to be done also before an actor flies out to you, before any rehearsals happen, before any travel days happen, that must have been submitted. And yes, as I said, the penalties for not completing it, our SAG will probably pull your SAG certification and potentially even contact the actors and tell them to stop work. So it's quite important that you do complete that. So SAG contracts. I'm sure this is the thing that is often a little bit elusive. Like I said right at the start, it's really important that you check what the process is with the studio that you're working with. Because in many cases, a production office might never see a SAG contract because that will all go through a separate union department. I have done shows where it was suddenly turned back to us and the production office was required to fill out all these contracts. As you'll see, I've kind of just done a quick pull. We'll go into a bit more detail on this, but a quick pull of a contract from a previous show. Similar to equity, when you sign up with SAG, you'll be given the pack of contracts that you're allowed to use. These are specific to your production. They're the latest. They'll have, you know, any changes that have been applied over the years will all be implemented into this contract. It's actually, in terms of the bit that you need to fill out, it's incredibly straightforward. It's really just asking for a lot of the key details that you'll already know. For instance, the actor, the loan out, how much they're getting paid, what their start date is, and then everyone signs. So it's pretty straightforward. The thing to remember is really you'd only be looking at daily and weekly SAG contracts and daily and weekly stunt SAG contracts. Those are really the only ones you'll see in the pack, because if you enter into World of Schedule F, it's a buyout. And in all cases, that will be dealt with between the agents and business affairs. It'll be a far more robust contract, far more detailed, cover a lot of other elements. And that process will be the same everywhere. I didn't actually look at any of my bullet points in there, and I'm just making sure I haven't missed anyone. You'll realize I have a tendency of just, you know, when you kind of like gone through a lot of this, a lot in your head, I spurt it out. So I have to double check I've not missed anything. Oh, and obviously when you are completing SAG contracts, it's important that you are sending a copy to accounts so that they can set up payments and start raising the appropriate payments. And a copy must always be sent to SAG once it is fully executed on both sides. When you're signing up for a production, SAG will give you key representatives that you can talk to. In most cases, there are a set of generic email accounts that you can send your paperwork to. So we'll get into Exhibit Gs very shortly, but that just goes to a very generic email account, and you'll send it weekly. In most cases, there'll be a representative that you send it to. So this is that same contract that we just looked at. This is a weekly contract. I've just kind of gone in a little bit more detail. It's deceivingly simple. And I remember the very first time I looked at this, I thought, I'm missing something. What have I missed? Why is it so easy? Largely, the way SAG operates is the full collective bargaining agreement sits separate. You won't see that actually in the physical contract because you can look that up online. In all cases, the contract will just refer back to the collective bargaining agreement. That collective bargaining agreement, by the way, is about 1,000 pages. So is a thrilling read. I advise you to read every page in great detail. Yeah, so this is an example of a weekly contract. As you can see, as I was saying earlier, you'll just put in the dates. This contract is raised. You'll put in the total compensation period. You'll put in the start date. You don't need to do any terminations like you would with a crew contract, like a UK crew contract. You don't necessarily need to issue out notice letters or end dates because it's all dictated by the day out of days. Obviously, you need to provide certain elements like the artist address, a lot of their key employment information, and then all parties sign. Very, very simple. There is, often you'll see there'll be an additional page attached to this, potentially a rider, like if there's any nudity involved or anything like that, there'll be a separate rider for that as well. But the actual contract is very, very simple. Exhibit Gs. Hopefully, if any of you have ever dealt with SAG on any production at any level, you might have seen an Exhibit G at some point. This is, in terms of the production office and the AD department, this is the document you're going to see every single day. It's the one that's going to generate the most amount of labor. So an exhibit is a timesheet. This is the timesheet for the actor in its very simple form. That is, it's just there to collect the times, and the performer is there to sign it as well. It's important because obviously, as we've discussed in terms of the setup of all these contracts, it's what's going to determine how much payment is due to the actor in terms of things like forced calls, missed meals, all of that other elements. So it's important. It's not just a timesheet that we're putting times on. This is actually something we need to be paying a lot of attention to, because this is what SAG will be enforcing if there's any payment disputes. So this is completed every day by the second AD. They'll complete an Exhibit G. Often, if you've got a lot of SAG cast, you can put all of them onto the same one. I would prefer to do that personally because it makes it a little bit easier. Sometimes they like to all give them a separate one. Just remember, you'll be doing this every day that the SAG-AFTRA's in, so you don't have a lot of paperwork if you do it all separately. So keeping it as streamlined as possible. And then the thing to remember is SAG do require to have these every week. So at the end of every Friday, as a process, I would be ensuring the office as I've checked through them and the office is sending them to SAG. Once upon a time, you had to put them in the mail. These days, you can send them via email, much easier. I'll tell you now, you won't get a single response unless there's a big issue. You won't get a response from SAG. You'll just be sending them in. No news is good news as far as I'm concerned. But a copy must go to SAG, and also a copy must go to your accounts team because they will be making the payments. Some of the key elements that we need to just be aware of when we're looking at Exhibit G. I put a link actually. When I was researching this, there's a great page. It's not very clear on this sheet, I'm afraid, but the Studio Binder. There's a great page on how you fill out an Exhibit G. I'd highly recommend going to that. If you've never filled one out before and it's your first time, obviously you'll have a copy of this slide deck, but pop over to that as well. It'll help give you a good idea. But in terms of the details that you're going to see, with certain abbreviations that are always used, which the Exhibit G does make clear what abbreviations are allowed to be used. So for instance, you'll see S equals a start, so that's the first paid day of an actor. R for rehearsal, FT if they're doing a fitting day, T for a test day, W for a work day. It all gets quite self-explanatory. I won't. You get the idea. Travel days obviously all need to be applied in there. Whole days need to be applied in there, and their last day of work, the finish day, that's important. That needs to be reflected. And then meals. This is the thing I like to always make sure everyone is aware of, because it's important that, yes, it's the second AD that needs to be filling this out, but I would say as a PM, UPM, as a coordinator as well, I would always ask that other people are looking at the times and are understanding the times that have been put in, because, you know, working on a film set is a tough world, and things are changing a lot, and having additional eyes on things like this when it can get very expensive, I think it's very important, and we can all help each other. One of the key things I'm always looking for is the meals, because the meals can change things quite drastically. In particular, you'll see something called an ND meal, a non-deductible meal. So the rule of thumb with actors is they must eat every 6 hours. And remember, our actors are portal to portal. So their 6 hours is going to come a lot quicker because we need to include that travel time in their day. However, there is something called a non-deductible meal. And this is very important when you're dealing with SAG, particularly if you're doing a very, very big SAG production. You'll see the ADs are hot on this, hopefully, are very hot on this. The ND meal is something that can be used in the first 2 hours. It's a 15-minute break. Non-deductible because it can't be deducted from their total time. But the important thing for us is that resets the clock. It resets that 6 hour count, which then means, for instance, if an actor has had 45 minutes to an hour of travel time to get in the morning, straight away they get their ND meal of 15 minutes. It resets that clock, which means they're suddenly coming a bit more in line with the rest of the unit that will be having their lunch. Super important that you do that. Otherwise, the likelihood of you ending up breaking the 6 hour rule is very high, and you're going to start getting meal penalties, which we don't want. So that would be my tip to always make sure you're checking for. Make sure the ND meal is in. It can be taken as soon as they arrive. So you'll see, you know, the actor has dropped. Minutes, the breakfast is, you know, pushed in front of their face. They're shut and locked in their trailer. Have that and then go to hair and makeup. Whichever way you want to do it, make sure that's applied, because it will save you later on down the line when you really need that time. The first meal, as I said, meals are every 6 hours. So your first meal is 6 hours from call or 6 hours from the ND meal. And then after that, if you've carried on for another 6 hours, then a second meal is also applied. I'm hoping your days are never that long that you're entering into that world, but it's something to be aware of. As I said, in terms of travel times, remember the turnaround. Remember that there is 12 hours required between the time that they are dropped back home and the time they are picked up the following morning. You need to remember the time that they leave for location. So there is a separate allocation in that. That is the time that they're leaving their homes. That's their start time. The time they arrive at locations, that's the time they've arrived at the unit base. The time they leave location, that's the time they're then off home from their distant location. And they arrive at studio. So that's more for the US element. So if they're just going to a studio, then they're not on location at all. Then you'd be filling out that one. So this is what an Exhibit G looks like. This is the close-up view of it. So as you can see, you've got a separate element specifically for the cast, the character they're playing. We don't use pseudonyms here, by the way. This is because this is for SAG. This needs to be their actual name. It needs to be their actual character. I know a lot of shows we're using pseudonyms for everything. We're trying to keep it as under the radar as possible. Don't do that to SAG because they will have no idea what you're talking about. So it needs to be the exacts. And again, as we were discussing, the drop downs of like whether it's a work day, a rehearsal day, or a fitting day, or a travel day, that's all denoted in the top here, and you should write down on the far right. Then the key bits that we were just discussing, so that's really the work time, so the time they start and the time they finish. The meals is in a separate section. Again, ND meal, so that's the time they start. They're resetting the clock. Then you've got their first meal, their second meal if it's applicable, and the travel time. That's very much more specific to us because we are always a distant location. So understanding the time they start their work, leaving their home, they arrive back, all of those elements are taken into account here. So as a little guide, let's say the actor is picked up at 6 o'clock. So that will be filled out in the leave location element. So now 6 o'clock, the clock has started ticking. They're now taking 45 minutes to travel. So now that's the time they arrive on location. That's them arriving at the unit base. We're then going to give them an ND meal of 15 minutes. So that's exactly the same time they've arrived. They've gone straight into their trailer. Breakfast was there ready for them. The clock is ticking. It's now 7 a.m. Now we're going to put them straight into hair and makeup. You'll notice, especially in the US, they don't tend to use 24-hour clock. So I would suggest using it as a 12-hour clock when you're recording times on a Exhibit G. So things like 7A is very standard in the US. Now they're in hair and makeup. And then finally at 7:45, they've had a nice quick turnaround and they're out onto the set. So that's kind of how a morning would look on an Exhibit G. And then obviously once the day has finished, you would fill out the time they've been dismissed from set. They've gone back to hair and makeup. So you put the time, you put the time that is applicable there. Sorry, I've kind of gone too far. And then finally the time that they're dismissed and the time that they start traveling back home and have arrived home. Does that make sense? By all means, if I'm word vomiting, you can interrupt me. It's fine. And then, so just with the Exhibit G, like I said, you're going to be seeing this every single day. Every single day that the production is in work, there needs to be an Exhibit G filled out. Again, even if the actor is not in and they're on a hold, there needs to be an Exhibit G to show and replicate their hold day. There needs to be an Exhibit G to show their travel day back home. So you need to always be filling one out. And every week they should be sent back to SAG and your accounts team. Then when you get to the end of a production, they'll ask, SAG will require a final cast list. Just as a general thumb as well, be aware that SAG will never all of this stuff that I'm telling you, SAG will never prompt you for. They'll tell you when you've missed the deadlines and nothing has appeared, but they will not prompt you for it during the production. So it's important that you're aware that you need to be submitting these things and you're looking for the correct documents. The final cast list is a document that is widely available on the SAG website, but the pack that you receive with the contracts, a draft of that is also available in there. And this is required when the production wraps. And this is where all of those other elements that we were talking about at the start that you need to make sure you've written down, they all come into play again in this document. So you're going to need to show each actor that was SAG that performed with you, you need to show the total remuneration for that actor. You need to show things like their SSN, their social security number, their SAG number. You need to show their address, total weeks that they've worked, their base salary, the total amount that they've earned. All of those elements all need to be recorded in this final document, and it's expected that the production office would submit this. Again, as I said at the very, very start, please check with every studio because some of them operate differently. In a case where you have a big major studio that has its own union department, they will often do this themselves at the very end. If you're not with one of those productions and you are sort of with a mini major studio, I know, for instance, I've worked with some of the smaller studios and they don't have a union department. This is very much expected that the production coordinator would be submitting this. Yes, as I said, completed by production on wrap. It's going to take all of those all the information that you've had in the contract and the exhibit Gs all comes together in this final document. Make sure you're checking the rate, the gross amounts with accounts so that it is the correct amount that you've paid them. And then as a final thing, you will issue this to the SAG rep on wrap. And actually, as with every SAG document, I didn't even mention this with the exhibit G, as with every SAG document, you'll see, in fact, I can't see it on here, but on most SAG documents, they tend to include the details of where that needs to be sent. So there'll be the specific email account that it needs to go to. So often I think it's theatricalsag@sag.org or something like that. It's always the same, to be quite honest. And you'll send all of this over as a final document. Again, keep a copy in the wrap folder because you'll need that as part of your final delivery to the studio. And make sure accounts have a copy of this as well. On top of that, when you've finished production, SAG also asks for something called a data report. I just noticed I've spelt report wrong. I do apologize. It's a sticky T. So again, SAG won't ask for this, and it's something that you just need to be aware that you do need to submit when you have wrapped the production so that you don't get a call, 6 months down the line, having finished the production, where is it? Again, please check just in case there's a union department that fills this out for you, but this is generally just a fairly generic document that SAG have started doing. This is very similar if you've got any DGA crew, for instance, your first or your UPM might be DGA. There is a similar document that DGA ask as well. And this is basically just covering all the different bits of information about the hiring of your cast. It's looking at ethnicity, it's looking at the split between male and female, it's looking at ages, it's trying to take all of that into account and putting it together. It's not asking for names here, by the way. It's a very generic report. It's just wanting to know numbers and how that's displayed. Any individuals are obviously counted on this. What was I saying? Any individuals counted on the weekly report should be counted. So anyone that you've employed, whether they're a daily or a weekly, should appear on this. Displayed as a number, not a name. Again, a copy of this should go direct to the SAG rep and the studio, and keep a copy in your SAG rep folder as well as part of your deliveries. Wow, I kind of sped through that at great length speed. So I'm sure there's a lot of questions. This is kind of an open forum now. So if there's anything specific that you have that I haven't covered, if there's something you want me to go over again, we can whiz back through the slides. Any questions, any thoughts?
Hey, Kay, do you want to go?
Hello. Can an actor refuse a non-deductible meal break?
It's not really the actor's choice whether they take it or not. I mean, they could always refuse it, yes, but ultimately you'd just be saying, this is your ND meal. It's important that I have you take this now. It's really the production's decision for the actor to go into a break at that point. Don't get me wrong, the reality of dealing with a very tricky individual might be very different. in those cases, I would say it's more a negotiate. Suddenly becomes a negotiation. Please, can you take the ND meal? I'd like you to take the ND meal now. That's how we planned our day. It's important that you take it. You know, in any case, they are still an individual, so yes, they could refuse it, but I would say that that is part of their contract, and it's how you're running the day. That would be the negotiation.
Thank you.
Sorry, it's not very. Yes, they must take it. Lock them in the room. No, unfortunately not. It's but contractually, there is an element there, yes. Any other questions? Anything you'd like me to go back over? Anything that wasn't specific or clear?
You can use the chat box as well, guys. I realise that some of you are on set or on location at the moment, so if there's anything, you can pop it in the chat.
I have another question. So
Go for it.
We're here.
if it's a locally based actor, so if you know you're in London and you have a SAG actor, do the distant location rules still apply?
Oh, that's a great question, actually. Yes, they do. Well, okay, so there's a degree of negotiation here, right? So I'm going to assume, let's make the assumption that they're probably going to be a Schedule F, right? So they're a buyout actor. What will most likely happen if all parties are aware that they are based in London, you might be working that into the deal. So I have known productions where you can't get rid of the portal to portal entirely, but you can be specific on where you're setting that portal to portal count, i.e., I know this individual has 2 residencies, one of which is at this location. We'd like to set that as the resident location marker point. It's a negotiation. What you have to remember is a lot of the time this is being negotiated with the agent, and the agent is always going to say they have a base in LA. So that's just something you need to be aware of. But I have done a few shows now where there's an actor that, you know, is as British as they come, but is a SAG member, and we've agreed, okay, look, this is their residence. It is always still a distant location. That is the general rule of thumb, but you can be a bit more specific on how distant that particular location is. And in some cases, actually, what we have done is, because it's a distant location, and the actor we know is based, we've technically rebased, because I think we were shooting in a studio that was just a little bit further outside of London, and we agreed that we would rebase that actor to a hotel nearer the studio as a way of sort of dealing with that. Everyone was on board with that. They were happy with it. But that sort of changed the timing just to reduce the travel time. Again, it's a negotiation. It's very much at the behest of the agents, but the minimum is it's a distant location.
Thank you.
Anyone else got anything else? I know we've got a mixture of ADs and production on today, so if you have got any questions, please feel free. I know Steve's going on to a job next week, so this is your chance to ask him at the moment for these kind of sessions. We've got him here, so if there is anything that you've come up against on productions that you kind of want to ask about, or anything that you've kind of come across recently, please feel free to ask any questions that you've got.
Well, one thing I will say is, particularly with SAG and also DGA as well, particularly I think for us in the UK, there's sort of like a, how do I describe it? There's kind of like a weird mist around it. So it's like this sort of slightly grey area that we don't fully understand. Like, you know, we understand how equity works. And the thing to remember is a lot of the principles in equity are very similar to SAG. You know, how those times are divided, how the contracts are split. There's a lot of similarities. And in most cases, the thing to remember as well, particularly with SAG, is if you're doing any sort of film work in the US, everyone is SAG to a degree. You might have something called a Taft-Hartley, but primarily your cast are all going to be SAG. And that's not just 1 to 3, that's the entire way, which means there's a lot of resources that you can find if there's very specific things. One thing particularly with this course, I kind of want to just make sure that I'm giving you enough of the key bits of information that you need. So if there's something that you really, really can't work out in the moment, because let's face it, when you're in the heat of a production, there's always a moment at least you're kind of understanding the principles of how a contract is put together, so you can be specific in finding that answer somewhere. SAG are very, very good at putting a lot of resources out. And I would always highly recommend visiting the SAG website. Also, there is, particularly if you want to get into the details of rates, in details of fringes and how that's all applied and the contract elements, I would highly recommend, there's a document from Entertainment Partners. The name of it has completely gone out of my head. I will find it in a second. It's a great document that I'm going to quickly find it now. I use on a daily basis. It is a paid for document, just to be clear. I'm not with Entertainment Partners. I'm not pitching any of their stuff, but it's a great document. I find it very useful. It's basically like a Bible of all of the unions. It's got all of their details in and all of the different elements, and it's updated every year. Also, another really good resource that I use quite a lot. Oh, sorry, it's called Paymaster. There we go. It's called Paymaster from Entertainment Partners. I'm a big fan of that. It's got everything you need. It brings it all together in a nice compact document that you can search through. Another thing that I use quite a lot, and you can find that online, is something called the Jeffords Guide. This is not an official guide per se. It's actually been put together by an AD from a long time ago, and it's updated fairly regularly. And it basically goes through all the US unions, and all the key elements are shown very, very easy to read, depending on whether it's distant location, domestic location. It goes into all the different elements. I would highly recommend getting a copy of the Jeffords Guide. It's available as a PDF online. It's free. It's a great resource. And in fact, often, in particular, I did a show not that long ago where I had a lot of SAG cast and a lot of SAG stunts. And I kid you not, that PDF, I don't think I shut it in 6 months. It's just always open on my desktop.
Can I just ask you a question, Steve?
Yeah, of course.
Really, it's to do with hold days and travel days. So if we've got an actor coming across, say on the Monday, from New York or whatever else, and then they're working on the Tuesday, and then you're holding them until, say, the following Monday before you work them again. So you pay the travel day on the Monday, you work them on the Tuesday, and then I got slightly confused by what you were saying as per travel days for a US actor in the UK. I presume you would just pay hold days for the period in between the two work periods.
You would, yeah.
Rather than
essentially the contracts are like 6-day weeks, right? So you're paying hold days on any of those days in between.
Yeah.
You wouldn't do it on a Sunday, for instance. That's assuming how your week is planned. For instance, if you're traveling them on the Monday from the States, you're more than likely going to need to put in a whole day on the Tuesday, so you wouldn't work them on the Tuesday.
No, I was just, for simplicity's sake, I was just
but you'll basically you'll be filling in the whole days in between that, but you wouldn't be doing the entire week as a whole. Does that make sense?
Right, okay. Yes, it does. It's just I got a little bit confused about what you were saying about travel days, because you couldn't return. Effectively, you weren't being able to send the person back, the actor back to their home. I got confused. I thought you were meaning that you had to pay them travel days.
Oh, no. It has been, it's because essentially they're coming from the States, and it's not a case of, popping them back to London or something like that. The idea is that they'll probably more likely end up on a weekly contract rather than a daily contract. Because it's more efficient in terms of how you budget.
Sure. No, it was just about that difference between them, and also just a tiny little question. Because we're working portal to portal, I noticed on the timesheet there's a time for pickup, but then it seemed to only be a time for leaving location rather than a time for return to hotel or accommodation.
No, there is actually. Hold on, let me just bring it back up.
Is there? It's just
Hold on.
I wasn't sure whether I didn't see it or not.
I might have, in the speed, sped through it a bit too quick. Hold on, let me pull it back up. Here we go. So in terms of their return, so obviously this is their morning. When they're dismissed from the set, that's
Yeah,
the time that you'd put there. You'd
yeah,
then assume that they go straight back to hair and makeup and give the time that they're finally dismissed from hair and makeup, because within just as a general rule, so you're aware, within the general agreement, there is a 15-minute period outside of the time that's given for hair and makeup, but that's for a simple removal, right? So that's not
Mhm.
counting in the day. So they give a specific time of when they're dismissed from hair and makeup, because in large cases, 15 minutes is not enough. And then the time they leave location is applied here.
Yeah, but
As
where's the
in,
time?
sorry, dismissed from hair and makeup is the time that they leave. And sorry, I see what you mean. As in, there isn't the time that they arrive
Yeah,
back.
there's not a return to drop off time at home.
Wonder where
It's
I
only location.
old.
So
I would probably just change that on here and just put the time that they arrive home as the studio, because you wouldn't be using the studio portion at all.
yeah, no, that's right. I wondered whether that was, because it does seem a bit strange that it's arrive at studios right at the very end of
Yeah.
what is the end of the day. So
Yeah, I would just make an adjustment on there and show that as their final time back. Again, with all cases, remember that the SAG paperwork is very much based on a domestic point of view, assuming that
yeah,
they're working out of a US studio. Home is
yeah,
like 15, 20 minutes away.
yeah,
And on the rare occasion, they go on location. For us, that's our base. That's how we operate with all SAG cast. So sometimes there's a few little tweaks that need to be made.
yeah. Okay, okay. Good job. Thanks.
No problem. Any other questions? I think I've kind of breezed through that a bit too quick. I do apologize. I have to admit, these courses, you never quite know what the best amount of time to spend on things is and at what speed you're going to go through it, because there's some versions of this I've done where people want to go into like the minutiae of the contracts, as in like the collective bargain, and that can take a lot. And I'll tell you now, it's a bit dull. So I want to try and at least give the key elements of how we operate, that we can look up if we need other additional information aside. What I will say is I am obviously onto another production, but I think on the slide deck that you'll get given, my email address is on there. So if there's ever a question, because realistically, it's only when you're in the moment that you'll suddenly have another question. By all means, feel free to reach out. It's not a problem.
So going once, going twice. Does anybody have any questions? Is there anything around, there is the minutiae, there is clauses, there is things that kind of come up that maybe are a little bit confusing, or things that you've come across? I'm going to give you one last chance to ask any questions that you might have around those things. Anyone at all? Okie dokie. So we will send out that slide deck that's got all the information on it, and also just a couple of links of the documents and things like that Steve has mentioned as well on the session, just so that you can kind of have a look into those and see. This is the first time that we've done a session around kind of SAG paperwork and stuff like that, so we'll be really keen to get your guys' feedback on the session, and if you'd like more sessions that go into more detail on specific sides of things, if you'd like to go into that boring stuff that Steve's mentioned and kind of do a deep dive into any of that stuff, if that would be of interest to you, please do let us know. We're really happy to facilitate anything that's useful to you guys. So please do give us your feedback on if you'd like more sessions around a similar topic, and if there's anything else that you'd like sessions on as well, we're always here, so you know to give us a shout. But if nobody has anything else just now, I'd like to say thank you so much for joining and listening in today. I do realise that a lot of you are on production, so we really appreciate you taking the time to listen in, and I hope that you found the session useful. We'll be sending out some follow-up, and we will speak to you hopefully very soon, and enjoy the rest of your days.